Financing for development. Unlocking investment opportunities. Increasing domestic public resources and improving public expenditure efficiency with James Brumby.
Well, domestic resource mobilisation really involves all the resources that a country is able to raise itself. So for the most part that is taxation, but it also includes non-tax revenue. And what we see in developing countries is that the amount of tax, for instance, that's raised is around 17% of GDP on average, whereas in OECD countries, the average is around 35%. So that difference between 17 and 35%, in a sense, represents a massive opportunity for developing countries to access more resources from their own people and apply those resources to development objectives. It far, far outweighs the amount of development assistance that can be provided from donor partners. Public expenditure efficiency is really about the conversion of all those resources into development results on the ground. Now, what really matters for that is doing the right things and then doing the right things well. So that's got an allocative aspect, and then it has a sort of technical or productive aspect. There are many examples of countries that have taken steps to increase resources through domestic resource mobilisation on the one hand, and or also spending that money better. So on the taxation side, for instance, El Salvador has increased their tax as a proportion of GDP from 11% to 14% through a combination of tax policies and tax administration efforts. And that's generally what we find. We generally find you need to do things in terms of policy and in terms of administration to be successful. Then on the spending side, a lot of developing countries spend a large proportion of their budget resources on fuel and energy subsidies. Indonesia, originally a member of OPEC, has always had a policy of supposedly directing resources to protect the poor from rising energy prices. In fact, the benefit of that policy has not been the poor, it's been the middle class and, quite frankly, the well-to-do. But in recent times, Indonesia has changed that policy and has reduced spending on subsidies from 2.4% of GDP to about 0.8% of GDP. The net result is that those resources have been released for other purposes. Part of that is in terms of managing the aggregate fiscal position, making sure that deficits don't get too large. But a lot of the resources have been directed to improving the infrastructure in Indonesia and improving the access to that infrastructure. So that's a gain for the poor. So the major obstacles that typically stand in the way of improved public expenditure efficiency, I think of in terms of 3 C's. There are capacity problems, there are issues around capture, and then there can be issues around corruption. So with capacity, we typically deal with that through technical assistance and the provision of advice and knowledge to strengthen country systems. We have a number of techniques for doing that. One is to apply a thing called a PIFA, which is a Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment, and that sort of diagnoses for countries where they have problems. Around capture and corruption, they're really political economy problems, and I think we are seeing quite a lot of development and innovation in terms of the way countries deal with that. Brazil and the Philippines, for instance, have been very creative about bringing voices from the population into the questions about allocating resources. Capture definitionally is about when narrow interests capture the resources of the state. So if you bring in voices of the population, you tend to counteract that. Corruption is a multifaceted problem. We've seen strengthening anti-corruption authorities in a number of countries. We're also seeing that backed with direct preventative measures and strong leadership in some countries which make clear that corruption is not an option. What are the consequences of the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of domestic resource mobilisation and public expenditure efficiency? And how is this a different situation from what we had under the Millennium Development Goals? Well, I think first of all, the SDGs are much more comprehensive, they're much more challenging, and it's very clear that they cannot be achieved in developing countries without very substantial mobilisation of domestic resources. The second thing is, if you're looking to apply more resources in pursuit of development objectives, there are other ways that you can raise funds. One is by spending the money better. That in a sense crowds in resources for better policy. So we mentioned the case before of fuel subsidies. This is a classic case of spending less on fuel subsidies, more on direct provision, say in health services, education services, or even cash transfers, is a better way to move closer to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in the period between the MDGs and the SDGs, the world, I think, has changed quite a lot. One of the areas it's changed is in terms of technology and practice. So in the area of technology and practice, in particular on the tax side, we've seen a concern for the ways that many large taxpayers have been able to really contrive or redirect their operations in a way to minimise their taxes in particular countries. So this makes the challenge for those countries much greater, but it also means that the only solution to addressing that challenge is through improved collaboration and cooperation. So that's exactly what we're seeing now in international tax. That's also what we're seeing in the area of illicit financial flows. The degree of cooperation and the application of technology to try and really muscle down on illicit financial flows in the past few years has really been quite remarkable. The other area I think that we've seen a lot of change practice is that citizens are being brought in much more directly to questions about resource allocation and management. So initially this came out of the idea of community-driven development, but now we're seeing in countries such as I mentioned before, Brazil, Philippines, but in many countries we're seeing the voice provided to citizens to either influence local government resource allocation decisions or even central government. And I think that that's increasing the effectiveness of spending and holds great opportunity for the quicker achievement of the SDGs.